Well, hi there. Hello, and welcome back to the Pitch Grid. Thanks so much for tuning in to another episode. We are a podcast that covers the National Football League or American football, as well as the English football's EFL Championship, and we cover all the news, analysis, players, and games that all happen to be of interest the last week or so. And without further ado, let's get right on into it. Let's head gridside as we have a lot to cover in terms of, well, Aaron Rodgers once again is in the news as he went on Pat McAfee's show last week. Rodgers decided to come out and talk about all the drama around him lately, getting released from the Jets, all the speculation around him concerning the Vikings and the Steelers, and if he was even going to retire. Well, he did address it in a very roundabout way, let's just say. Rodgers talked about how the Jets, they of course released him, and he talked about his conversation with Aaron Glenn, the new head coach for the Jets from the Detroit Lions, and he did not hold back at all. He talked about how his meeting with Glenn was very brief. He talked about how Glenn made a comment about he thought he would be undermined by Rodgers, that his authority as a coach would, not to mention that he also apparently said, according to Rodgers, that he felt like he would be always looking over his shoulder. And I mean, that seems like a fair analysis considering, what we've seen the last year or so from the Jets in terms of how Rodgers has really kept a lot of the drama going. He hasn't played very well, but yet at the same time, Robert Saleh was fired, Joe Douglas was kicked out. A lot of stuff like, trading for a receiver based off Madden ratings. And if the reports are true, like wanting Alan Lazard and a list of players apparently that he wanted when he came to the Jets a couple of years ago. So, like, it's not an unfounded accusation. There's been reporting about all these kinds of things, but Rogers apparently was not very happy with these kind of comments and insinuations because he said he flew across the country and all he got was just a bunch of weird, what he called strange comments. He said he was shocked to hear these kinds of things. He was asked about how how he wanted the Jets to release the information that he was being released. He said he didn't care. And then he went on to talk about the possibilities of his career now. He talked about the Steelers and the meeting with the Steelers. Said it was a very clandestine operation. Apparently, he didn't go there with the intent to sign or anything, just to meet up with Mike Tomlin and the owner and GM. Art Rooney, the Steelers owner, he has said at league meetings that he felt like that Rodgers was going to be, quote, definitely headed their way, according to sources and reports he had close to him. Obviously, Rodgers is still not there. That's been a month now since the league meetings. It just feels very weird talking about the Vikings. Also, he said he was open to the Vikings still, but he realized that it might not be a possibility considering JJ McCarthy's whole situation there, being the starting quarterback, being a top 10 draft pick last year. And then, of course, he did discuss retirement actually. Said it was a real possibility. Said he would be prepared if he did want to retire, that he would step down and but he wanted to do it in his terms. It sounds like there's not much that's changed. He's still considering all his options. It feels limited, his options do, considering the Vikings don't feel like they're headed in a direction of pursuing Rodgers, though people like Rossini are still reporting that Rodgers is still an option for them. Steelers have become the clear favorite, especially since they're a team that is very desperate for a quarterback, and we're now 4 days from the draft, and they still do not have a quarterback. It feels very misleading by Rodgers just to go on a show for 45 minutes and basically air his dirty laundry about his former team once again. This feels very similar to when he went on the Pat McAfee show when he was being released by the Packers. And he went on and talked about how he had some grievances with the organization. And then, of course, later he did have his program where he announced he was going to the Jets. Can we take anything really from this? I don't think so. I feel like his two choices are either retirement or play with the Steelers. And I feel like even then, He feels like a very anti-Steelers choice. Just the culture, the organization at the Steelers doesn't feel very you know accommodating to a style that Rodgers is. Where he likes to be in the media. He also tends to be the star of the team. Steelers are very much more of a team first. We all grit and grind together and are very culture oriented, which is one of the few teams that is just almost synonymous with a similar culture that they've had throughout the entire organization's history. So, do we think that they could get Rodgers still? Absolutely. I wouldn't be shocked also if the Steelers do look for a quarterback in the draft, but everything's still on the table. I don't know personally if you're an organization why you would want to go for Rodgers unless you're absolutely desperate. You got the likes of DK Metcalf in a trade from the Seahawks. And you upgrade the receiver room, try to help make George Pickens more comfortable with Pat Freiermuth. You make additions to the defense to bolster that because they were picked apart by the Ravens in the wild card round. You see the improvements the Steelers are making on both sides of the ball. They did let Dan Moore go to the Titans, but it feels like the Steelers were okay with that. And just now that Rodgers is in the mix, it feels very off-brand for the Steelers. For Rodgers, in the whole interview, it didn't seem like there was much of a purpose except to just air dirty laundry, just to, dispute any allegations of him being, the center of attention and, the cause of the problems in New York, which I don't think you really got a solid argument as to exactly why that would be the case. It feels, if anything, this actually fuels more of that discourse. And because you think about it, Rodgers really just took jabs, and there was concerns from a new coach that is saying, "Oh, I don't know if I can trust you looking over my shoulder." And if a new coach is coming in like that, yes, that can be outside bias, not knowing you personally, but at the same time, if that's the outside perception, then it's going to be hard to beat that anywhere else if you're Rodgers. And I feel like that's why teams are hesitant to give him a chance as well. Because if things go south with him, he's going to take a huge crap on your organization afterwards on a Pat McAfee episode. Is that the best way to handle it probably for Rodgers? I don't think so, but it definitely gets him press, and we're talking about it. So, I guess it works to an extent. It just feels very shallow, look at me, attention seeking vibe. And it sure doesn't beat the allegations of what everyone has been saying about him in the last season or so with him at the Jets. Let's move on to the newest extension. Cam Jurgens of the Eagles. He got an extension of 4 years, $68 million, and that includes $39.4 million guaranteed. That's a $17 million average annual value, which is only second in the league among centers, right behind Kansas City's Creed Humphrey, which is a very well deserved extension for Jurgens. Played very well last season. Was an anchor for that offensive line, especially in the Super Bowl. Helped pave a bit of stability after Jason Kelsey retired right before the season and went to ESPN. And now the Eagles have their guy locked up. I mean, people I think at the beginning of the season were not too sure how to think of Jurgens moving to center, but he performed very admirably. They set a single season NFL record for rushing with Saquon, and a lot of that credit obviously goes to the offensive line. It's a huge extension in terms of locking down the offensive linemen. I believe some of their last few extensions for the Eagles have been on the offensive line, just trying to cement the trenches as they do on the defensive side a lot of the times in terms of draft picks as well. The thing that also comes out of this, I would say, is the ceiling, the price tag for players keeps going up, and it feels like there is no end in sight. This is the second biggest contract among centers. That's not including offensive linemen. Like Trey Smith got a huge tag for the Chiefs. I think it was a $26 million tag to make him the highest paid offensive guard. And that's insane. This is not including Jamar Chase now being the highest paid non QB in the league. And then, of course, you don't want to get into the quarterbacks who are just getting now over 60 million a year, because of Dak and I think Tua now. It's insane just to think about how the price tag keeps going up with the more the cap goes up. And it just feels never ending. And of course, because the cap keeps going up, prices for players can also go up. And of course, players are going to want to get their bag, what they think they deserve in free agency. And that's great. You want the players to get paid. You want them to feel rightly compensated for their hard work, their playing. And at the same time, it feels like, how much are we paying in terms of market value? What is the market value currently of the quarterback, or when we're looking at any player that's looking to be re-signed in the league, we have to look at, what was the latest contract signed by someone in order to assess what the next player might be. I think some people wonder, when is the player going to be paid based off how he's played? Because you have the likes of, say, Tua, who had a couple of good seasons, but he's been very injury prone. Some would say he's a risk, and those are valid points. The organization obviously believes in him. They gave him the extension, but at the same time, has he played well enough to earn that extension? I think that's the question. And of course, some of that is they want stability in the franchise, which I get. Teams like the Dolphins haven't had stable quarterbacks for a while, so they want a centerpiece to build on and to make sure their future is bright. And at least having probably the most important position locked up. But like you look at the offensive line, I think it used to be like in the less than 10 mil for the longest time for offensive linemen, and now it's beyond that now, obviously, with 17 million being the second highest annual pay for a center, or 26 mil for a guard. It just feels almost like it won't end. And, there's GMs that are good about extending the cap and kicking the can down the road. That seems to be the philosophy a lot these days with GMs like Brett Veach and Howie Roseman. And it's smart because you can always make extensions. You can always backload the contracts to where eventually they'll have to pay up, but it might take a while. And you can keep building a team around those huge contracts. Now, of course, the landscape around the league is only getting bigger. The question is, does the cap keep growing? Because I believe the last cap hike right before free agency was the biggest cap hike again in NFL history because of all the TV revenue, the sales, all of that. Do you side with, players should be paid according to how they play, or do you think players should be paid market value? And right now, market value is king. And unless something changes about that, like you see a number of players paid that way and they flop, or something similar to that, and then I think you might see a change in it. But for now, it feels like you're going to have like maybe a $500 million quarterback before long. And it feels crazy to think that probably a decade or so ago, that would have been almost laughable when looking at how to pay a player. So it is interesting to see times change with the eras and the prosperity of the league. I do want to get to J.J. McCarthy of the Vikings. Kevin O'Connell, in a Monday interview, has said that McCarthy is set to go for practices and he's cleared for workouts, which is awesome considering, the setback he had last season, tearing his ACL in workouts and like a team scrimmage. And he had a lot of promise. There was a lot of hype coming out of Vikings camp about how good he looked. And then he has the tragic setback. Now he has a chance to come back even stronger, and we'll have to see how it goes. And if somehow, McCarthy does well, and I think we have track record to say that with O'Connell, he made Cousins better, and that's how Cousins was able to go to Atlanta. And then, of course, Sam Darnold last season was a fringe MVP candidate for most of the season. I don't think we can argue Kevin O'Connell's results, or O'Connell before he was in Minnesota. He had Matthew Stafford. So there's track record of him making quarterbacks good. I have no doubts that he can take a young high potential quarterback like McCarthy and make him good. It's just a question of now McCarthy is all of that. And he has the weapons around him that it can be easy. We saw last season with Sam Darnold how he didn't have to make a ton of plays. There were some points he did because of injuries and all that. But if the offense stays healthy, McCarthy doesn't have to do a ton, make a few clutch throws a game. He has to be a good game manager. If he can be a good game manager, make a couple of clutch throws, he might be able to do it and prove, honestly, to a lot of the NFL world that he was worth that top 10 pick. There's quarterbacks like Josh Rosen who were fringe quarterbacks, kind of like McCarthy was last draft. And they were like, oh, well, top 9 reasons why I'm going to prove them wrong. And then he flopped. But McCarthy seems to have a more quiet stance about him. And you have to respect the grind he's taken to come back so quickly, to be ready for workouts with an ACL, no less. And hopefully he does very well and is set up for success there in Minnesota with the wide receivers, the running back he has, and the offensive line. They have some pieces on the offensive line as well. So we'll have to see how it goes, but it looks very promising, and hopefully he does well coming back from the injury. Jackson Dart, the quarterback from Ole Miss, decided on Friday that he was not going to be attending the NFL draft, and I don't blame him. It feels like a lot of pressure to go to the green room. You have so many stories of players who went to the green room and they got passed over and they took longer than they thought they would be in the green room. And you could say this is kind of where he's nervous about his draft stock, but he's considered one of the top quarterback prospects in this draft, along with Jalen Milroe, Shadir Sanders, Will Howard, and Cam Ward. I can respect why he would stay home, just be with friends, family, not make it a huge deal, and in case he doesn't get drafted in the first round. I mean, we saw kind of how it made Will Levis feel when he dropped, considering where he was expected to fall. I mean, obviously, Will Levis hasn't panned out quite yet. Speaking of Will Levis, I saw a weird trade rumor the other day about how the Steelers apparently have been in on Will Levis trade talks. Can you imagine if the Steelers just traded for Will Levis instead of getting Aaron Rodgers? I mean, I'm not saying it would be ideal, but it could be a very fascinating fit considering he'd be with Arthur Smith. I know Arthur Smith gets a lot of flack, but that could be an interesting pairing for Will Levis just to see if he can be revitalized in his career after a sneaky season with Tennessee and not looking that great. But we'll have to see. We'll have to see how it goes on Thursday, first round. That's going to be so interesting. Prospects like Dart, you have Abdul Carter, Travis Hunter, so many good prospects, and you almost don't know exactly where they might go. And I kind of like it. There's a lot of intrigue surrounding where players might go. Not a lot of certainty. I think some people think they do. But the fun part of the draft is you never really know what teams really think about a player until the draft comes. And then, of course, the board shapes and falls and rises and trades happen. Lots of trade talks, of course, happening. I think there hasn't really been an that's been captivating enough to trade up into the top 5 picks yet. It would just be so interesting to see if that did actually happen, though. I think there's been talk about the Titans and Browns maybe trading out, but right now that doesn't seem likely. So yeah, 4 days. Can't wait for the draft. It'll be very fascinating and I think we'll get a much clearer picture of what teams will look like after the draft. And with all that stuff on grid side cover, let's head pitch side and talk about a very busy Easter weekend. And we start off with some kind of sad news. Tony Mowbray, after West Brom's 3-1 loss to Derby County, got sacked. The club made it official after the loss. Mark Venus was his assistant was also let go by the club with immediate effect. You could tell it was kind of coming, considering how poorly West Brom had been playing the last few weeks. They had not been looking good offensively, and they didn't look good defensively compared to how they had been early in the season. Because early in the season they looked unpenetrable for the most part. Oh, and they had that brief time where they top the league, and all of a sudden now it's just kind of fallen apart. You can tell they very much miss Josh Maja in that attack, and who you never knew one player could be so crucial for a team and their hopes. But there's been talks about from West Brom fans how Mowbray tried a target man style approach for West Brom, and how his tactics just seemed outdated and not suitable for the current game. And you feel bad for Mowbray because he came out from Birmingham City after the health scare, and he had to step down there at a time where Birmingham City were actually playing somewhat decent football considering where they were on the table last season. And then he steps down. He comes back. He feels better. He wants to get back into coaching. West Brom, they're looking for a new coach, and they hire him, and it just feels like the worst possible way to come back to managing to flop like he has, because West Brom were competing in the playoff places when he took over, and they looked good. They looked solid. They just needed to, find a couple wins to keep them stable, and yet they just couldn't find consistency in form or in anything. And the losses kept piling up, and the negative results didn't stop. The draws and losses, and I think they didn't have a lot of wins under Mowbray. But maybe he comes back better next time and has learned some things from this stint at the Hawthorns. It's a very unfortunate circumstance considering how high class and how highly regarded he is in a lot of football circles, especially in the lower leagues. Hopefully he bounces back better. West Brom season is very much over now at this point, with the loss to Derby County and coming out this weekend with 0 points, I believe. West Brom. No, they beat Watford. They beat Watford to keep their hopes alive, barely, and then lost to Derby County. Their seasons, I think, was pretty much over after they lost last weekend. So it feels harsh, but at the same time, you kind of understand that this might have just been a temporary replacement once Mowbray did not excel in his trial run at the Hawthorns. You kind of wondered if this was going to end poorly, and it did, and Mowbray's out. So we'll have to see, because West Brom have a lot of talent at that club, and if they have to reboot and restart it, that could be quite the project and could be very damaging to the club, not just player wise, but financially and such. So hopefully, West Brom are able to find a good coach. Since Carlos Corberan left, they have not been the same team, in my opinion. And this team was very much built in Corberan's image. Corberan did leave on his terms, and it's not West Brom's fault. But still, the managers they've had haven't really shown that they were going to make this an effective season for the Baggies. And after hoping they could make the playoffs and maybe get farther than they did last season when they lost to Norwich in 2 legs. So hopefully the club can bounce back, and hopefully Mowbray can bounce back as well. But we also had Leeds and Burnley promoted over this weekend with a couple of positive results for both sides. Leeds destroying Stoke 6-0, and Burnley getting the 2-1 win over Sheffield United saw them both clinch automatic promotion to the Premier League. So Burnley go up for the first time, asking Leeds are back in the Premier League for the first time in a few years. If they hadn't gone up, Leeds would have been in a lot of hurt, I think, with the parachute payments dwindling down. So now they get to go back, get some Premier League money. Um, Leeds, of course, always head and shoulders above everyone else in this league this year. Just the best team in the championship, bar none, and they showed it all year. Burnley, showed it in a different way than Leeds did, but they were incredibly dominant defensively, only allowing 15 goals with 2 games to go is an insane stat. They've set records already for that kind of prowess. It's an incredible season for both teams, and probably one neither fan bases will ever forget, just in terms of how dominant both teams were and how unstoppable they felt for the most part. Burnley, they were stuck in third for a long time. And then, of course, lately they just been on a red hot run, and they took advantage of Sheffield United, who dropped the bag this last month of the season, and now Burnley and Leeds take up those automatic promotion places and now leave Sheffield United to try to scrap up through the playoffs. and that's not going to be easy at all. Congratulations to Leeds and Burnley fans. Well deserved, well done. Enjoy your year in the Premier League. I do want to talk about briefly the gap that is considered by many to be between the Championship and the Premier League. A lot this season has been made because of how poorly like Southampton and Leicester have been, and Ipswich Town. All three Championship promoted teams did so poorly this season. Southampton setting so many records for how poorly they've played. I would argue that the transfer strategy for the clubs going up has not been great, and thus has affected the play from these clubs. I would argue that not identifying targets quickly enough, spending extravagant amounts on certain players, has hurt clubs, and thus it makes it feel like it's bad, but then you have teams that are Nottingham Forest that spend a ton. Some people think that's the way to go. There's so many different ways to do it. I do feel like you need to be smart with your purchases when you go up to the Prem. Obviously, you get that money, so it injects a lot of help into the financial coffers for the club. To me, it doesn't feel like it's as broad as it's been made out to be this season. Now, because we see a lot of players go up to the Premier League from Championship, like Morgan Rodgers, for example, that have just acclimated so well and played exceptionally there. I would say that those are exceptions, but still, a lot of good Championship players are in the Premier League and have made a huge impact on the Premier League season. So I would say that the gap is not as big as someone likes to make you believe it is. Let's recap briefly the Easter weekend that was. We obviously just went over the automatic promotion race. That is officially ended now with 2 games to play, as of course Leeds and Burnley, like we just discussed, are going top of the table. The title race is not decided yet, though, as both Burnley and Leeds are still tied. So it's still a matter of who's going to win the league, but it feels like Leeds are probably going to do it just because they have such a superior goal difference, and they don't have neither team has an incredibly difficult schedule coming up. So unless one decides to falter, it feels like Leeds are probably going to win the league. Sheffield United stopped the skid of 3 straight losses by beating Cardiff 2-0 in emphatic fashion. And then they come back and have an okay performance against Burnley. Of course, Burnley sealed promotion with the win. And the Blades are stuck in the playoff race now. And it feels very anticlimactic considering how these three at the top were just considered, to be head and shoulders above everyone else. And now it feels like a very messy situation that anyone down from fourth is very vulnerable and not the best of playoff contenders this season. Sheffield United, they look really good against lower teams, but against the tops, they've been struggling a bit. Even against the lower teams, they lost to like Oxford and Plymouth, and so they're vulnerable. Sunderland, they lost to Bristol City over the weekend. They also lost to Blackburn as well over Easter Monday fixtures as well. So they had a 0-point weekend, and that took a dent to the Sunderland going to third place hopes. But I don't think we could have expected that considering how big of a lead Sheffield United and Burnley had built there at the top 3. It didn't feel likely, but still, there was a crack there for a minute that Sunderland might have thought they could charge into third. But no, they're staying in fourth. Meanwhile, Bristol City had a topsy-turvy weekend. They go and beat Sunderland, right, in a very emphatic fashion and with a late winner. And then they go on Easter Monday and lose 3-1 to Luton Town. And we'll get to the relegation battle in a bit. But I think it shows how inconsistent the playoff area teams will be from 5th down to like 10th. It's very up and down and not really consistent. And I think that showed today in Bristol City. And then Coventry, of course, losing to Plymouth today didn't help. They lost 3-1 to Plymouth Argyle. They did that after coming off a very stellar performance against West Brom, a 2-0 win. It was a very emphatic one, too. It didn't feel like they were struggling at all for most of that game. There was a challenge that got a red card. West Brom they were down to 10 men, so that definitely helped Coventry's cause. But then going into today, everyone thought that it would be a very easy win for Coventry to be up on Plymouth. Well, they didn't, and now they're still somehow just barely hanging on to the playoff places. Meanwhile, Middlesbrough, they got a huge win against Plymouth Argyle. They did beat them 2-1 on a late Tommy Conway penalty. Some were considering it soft. It definitely isn't like the most egregious penalty of all time, but it definitely, I think you could call it a soft penalty. It got them valuable 3 points that pulled them right within chasing the playoffs. And then they come to Sheffield Wednesday. They go up 1-0. They have the chance with a penalty to go up 2-0, but it's a brilliant double save by the Wednesday keeper. And then they have a chance to go up again 2-0 with a Marcus Force chance, but it's denied. And then Wednesday come back and score 2 goals in the second half against a very fatigued Middlesbrough side that just couldn't keep up with the pace that Wednesday were having. Michael Carrick didn't use the substitutions very well in this game. It had to be very frustrating for Middlesbrough fans considering the results that happened with Coventry and Bristol City. A win would have put Borough in the playoff places. I mean, a lot of people are saying that Borough's season is over, especially Borough fans. It's not technically. It still is there. It just feels very undeserving at this point. I think a lot of fans just want the season to be over because of how apathetic at times the team has felt. And that's understandable to an extent, though I think as well you have to factor in it's a long season. There's tired legs. There's a lot of things to factor into something like this result, and it's a very disappointing one to be sure. But you want the playoffs, and I think they still have a very good chance of doing it. And on their day, Middlesbrough are a very good side. It's just it wasn't meant to be today after failing to go and kill the game off in that first half, where they played very well for the most part. Millwall had a rough start to the weekend, getting absolutely pummeled by Blackburn 4-1, and then come on Monday, getting the 3-1 win over Norwich City, who have also pretty much faded out of the playoff hunt. So they keep their playoff hopes alive. Their goal difference, though, is staggeringly bad for a top 10 team. They are the only top 10 side with a negative goal difference, by the way. -1 is their goal differential. And of course, that was probably very much helped by the thrashing they got at the hands of Blackburn Rovers. With 2 games to play, they have a shot, but it feels very unlikely. I mean, with Middlesbrough, it feels more likely just because they play Coventry the final game of the season, but that means they have to beat Norwich City, and if they want to have a chance at that, and hope either Coventry lose as well or draw. If Coventry drop points next week and Middlesbrough do win, that makes the final day even more interesting. It's not over. Middlesbrough feels like the only team right now outside the top 6 that will really challenge for the playoff position. Millwall could if Coventry were to somehow lose both their games, but they'd have to hope Middlesbrough drop a ton of goals. And I don't think that happens either, even though Middlesbrough aren't exactly the most sound defensively either. I think the loss at Blackburn kind of sealed Millwall's fate. Blackburn have been on a bit of a surge, as we discussed. They had a couple of huge wins, winning on Saturday against Millwall, beating Sunderland. So, huge way to get back on track for Blackburn. I think that's now 3 wins on the bounce for the Rovers. Um, after yeah, straight wins over Luton, Millwall, and Sunderland. So very impressive wins after 1 win and 5 from Valerian Ishmael. Luton Town are playing a lot of scrappy football, and they're the next ones to play Coventry. So Middlesbrough have some hope that maybe Luton, if they can show up again, might give a shot. But again, we'll have to see Saturday. Rovers just have looked like a completely different team over the Easter weekend and the weekend before that. So there's a lot of hope. Maybe, Ishmael turns things around for Blackburn Rovers. Who knows? It definitely has put a better pall on the club, considering the Venky's out situation there at Blackburn. West Brom, we talked about them earlier with Tony Mowbray. Their season's over in more ways than one, and it looks like a very interesting and very important offseason is up ahead for the Baggies. Swansea have crawled up into 11th. They are at 60 points. They have had a pretty good weekend on all accounts. They beat QPR on Easter Monday, and then on Good Friday, they had a 1-0 win over Hull City. So they very much have officially clinched, safety in the championship. The question is whether they're going to finish top 10 now at this point. Who knows? The way the Swansea are playing right now, they have a very good chance of doing that, considering the form West Brom are in right now. 2 games left that don't really matter, but still good run here by Swansea at the end of the season to finish strong and look impressive and maybe give them a positive outlook on the transfer window heading into next season. Watford, meanwhile, they come in having lost to Portsmouth on Easter Monday, and even on Good Friday they lost 2-1 to Burnley to set up the promotion for Burnley and Leeds. Watford had a lead in the game against Burnley. They looked good for the most part, and then Burnley just made a comeback. Burnley were just Burnley, and then held strong for the most part for the rest of the game. Zian Fleming scored against them. And then Pompey, on the run they've been on lately, they deliver the goods on Easter Monday. And that wasn't exactly what Watford wanted to see, but we kind of knew their season was over anyway. It just feels disappointing, for Tom Cleverley's side when they started out so well and looked like a side that could do something. A red card in this game against Portsmouth didn't help either after they went down 1-0 in the 25th with a Colby Bishop goal, but still, it feels very disappointing how Watford have kind of tailed off at the end of the season. Sheffield Wednesday, of course, we talked about their win over Middlesbrough today. And then on Good Friday, they also they went in and lost 2-0 to Stoke. So that kind of set the table for what felt like if Borough had gone up 2-0 today, probably would have killed off the game, to be honest, and probably would have sealed 3 points. But they didn't. I think that gave the Owls a lot of hope, and they went in and got the dub today. So huge 3 points, just to gain momentum in a dark period of time at the club with the whole protests around the ownership and all that. Definitely good to get a home win for the first time in a while as well, because they have been winless at home for a good stretch of time. And then, of course, you get to Norwich City, who get spanked to Kingdom Come by Pompey on Good Friday, 5-3. And then they lose 3-1 to Millwall. I mean, Norwich, we kind of knew their season was over a couple of weeks ago with some losses, and now it's really over. They were in the thick of playoff race too, and they just ever since they lost to Bristol City a month or so ago, you kind of could tell they were fading out of contention. Boreas Signs never got back on track after coming back from a 6 or 7 game suspension, and Josh Sargent was their main scorer, and they just couldn't find the net consistently. It's a very painful way to end the season for Norwich, to be sure. QPR, they came into this weekend, pretty much feeling secured. They got a win over Preston on Good Friday, and then, of course, lost to Swansea today. So kind of up and down QPR style, not really consistent, but enough consistent to give themselves safety in the championship and make sure that with the win on Good Friday, I think that sealed their mathematical safety. So good for them. It feels like a letdown season for QPR, considering a lot of people tipped them to maybe go up to the playoffs after how they ended last season under Martin Cifuentes. But now there's a lot of soul searching to do if QPR want to take the next step. Portsmouth, they had a very good weekend. They, of course, like we talked about, slumped on Norwich with 5 goals, a hat trick from Colby Bishop, and then they come in and beat Watford. So in a much more grinded out Pompey type game. Yeah, they feel like a very informed team at this point, and it kind of feels a shame that this is at the end of the year, but it definitely gives their supporters a lot of hope for next season that maybe they can take a step up and maybe do more than just barely survive in the championship next season. Good stuff from Pompey. They looked dangerous in that Norwich game all game. And even when Norwich would score, they always had a goal coming not long after from Pompey. They responded well after losing to Coventry like they did a couple weeks ago. So good for them. Let's see how they build from here. It's good to have that kind of atmosphere that they have at Fratton Park in the championship. Stoke, they had a good win over Sheffield Wednesday, 2-0, looked dominant in that game, and then they come in to Easter Monday and get absolutely trounced by Leeds United, 6-0. This was a rout of huge proportion. Joel Perot scored 2 goals in the span of 2 minutes, in the 6th and the 8th minute. He had 4 goals in this game, by the way. He had one in the 6th, the 8th, the 20th, and the 41st. So mind you, this doesn't count the other 2 goals. They were down 4-0 by half. And then Junior Firpo on the 26th out of 5th. So they were up 5-0 at halftime. And then Wilfred Yonto just decided to add the cherry on top in the 59th minute to make it 6-0. And from there, Leeds were okay. An absolute barrage of goals that just stunned the Potters and had Ellen Road rocking. It kind of felt inevitable coming into the Leeds game that they were probably not going to win, considering how red hot Leeds were and close to promotion. And Leeds were not going to just let that opportunity pass by again. Stoke City felt like a sacrificial lamb, but they performed well on Good Friday, and I think they have nothing to be ashamed of now that they've mathematically, I think, secured safety in the championship. Though that's still kind of tenuous considering, I mean, it's not mathematical, yeah, I guess, because they're still like 4 points above the relegation zone. But with 2 to play, I think a draw maybe next week probably secures it. So they're very close. Stoke are very close. Like Portsmouth, I think. Yeah, Portsmouth is technically not fully safe yet. They're at 52 points, so they're 6 points clear with 2 to play, but it feels unlikely. QPR, I think, is the last one mathematically safe at 53 points because they're 7 clear. Portsmouth and Stoke probably just need like a draw or a win to mathematically secure safety, but it feels very much assured for both of them. Preston North End, meanwhile, they have had a rough week. They lost to QPR 2-1, and then Hull City got a win over them 2-1 today. That wasn't the best. It dragged them right into the relegation scrap. They are now 3 points clear of safety with 2 games to play. So all of a sudden, they go from feeling very safe in the championship to all of a sudden feeling very scary. And that's not good, considering Luton Town and Derby County are kind of starting to get in form. But this relegation scrap is heating up in terms of how insanely close and tight it is and how well the teams at the bottom are playing lately. So a huge weekend that really puts a lot of fear now into this season for Preston. Also, they're fighting for something, and you have to wonder, are they going to do it? They have games against Plymouth, which is huge in terms of this relegation battle, and then Bristol City. So it feels like Plymouth is almost a must-win at this point, because if Plymouth keep playing the way they are, and let's just say somehow Plymouth pick up 3 points. Who knows what happens if they should somehow lose to Plymouth? Let's just say Oxford, Hull, and Derby County and Luton Town get results. If they all get results, that could see Preston drop down significantly. Um, Especially if Hull and Derby get results because they have a much better goal difference than Preston. This could be a very interesting weekend of the relegation battle. Preston definitely had the worst weekend of the championship, probably, besides Cardiff City. This just felt like a tragic way for North End. I think they were 13th coming into the weekend, and now they're in 18th. This is going to be very interesting because let's go to Oxford now. They had a pretty bleh weekend. They lost 1-0 to Leeds. I mean, there's no shame in that. 1-0 seems tame compared to, Stoke getting thrashed. But then they go to Cardiff thinking they could maybe get all 3 points, and a win probably secures a lot of comfort in the relegation scrap. Well, Cardiff, I believe they got a late goal to snatch a draw out of this. No, actually, Cardiff were leading for a good portion of this. They were in the 56th minute. They took the lead, and then Cameron Brannigan with a screamer equalized it in the 79th. So Oxford rescued a point because if they had lost, let's see, yeah, they had lost to Cardiff, they would have only been 2 points from safety, and they're currently only 3 points out. So still everything to play for the last 2 games for Oxford, who have Sunderland and Swansea, 2 teams that are very tough. Hull City, they had a very interesting weekend. They lost to Swansea 1-0, and then beat Preston North End to drag Preston down into the relegation zone 2-1. So the very polar opposites weekend, considering they win and lose. And now they have huge games against Pompey. Well, first they have Derby County, and then they have Pompey to end out the year. The Tigers are only 2 points from safety, and they feel like a very inconsistent team. They usually tend to play better against worse competition. Though sometimes they've played a lot better, getting results against upper level teams. They've been a little bit more frisky. It feels like they're in very much of a precarious situation. Lots of tight games for the relegation zone, to be sure. Derby County, they lost a huge relegation six-pointer to Luton Town on Good Friday, 1-0, and then they come in and embarrass West Brom 3-1. Now they're still tied on points with Luton Town because Luton Town did beat Bristol City. So they're still, based on a goal difference, not in the relegation zone, but they are still tied. And they have games against Hull City, like we just mentioned, and Stoke. So two teams that are the lower half and who still are very much in this scrap. Yeah, Derby County really needed the win against West Brom because otherwise I think they would have fallen into the relegation zone. So good for them to get a win, kind of stave off relegation for another day. We'll have to see how other results go in the next couple of weeks. Luton Town had a very good weekend. They beat Derby County, like we just said, and also Bristol City, who were surging at the time. So, very good week for the Hatters. They are making a strong push for safety at this point. They feel like the informed team in the championship. They still, have a lot of work to do, obviously. They have Coventry City next and then West Brom, so they definitely can't sit on their laurels for sure against either squad. West Brom will definitely not have anything to play for. Coventry have everything to play for on Saturday. So there'll be two desperate teams looking for some points. It should be a very good matchup. But Luton Town very much are pushing to try to break down the door of the relegation zone, and they feel like the one that could possibly get out the easiest. Cardiff City, they lost to Sheffield United 2-0 on Good Friday and then drew, of course, like we said, with Oxford United. A win probably would have seen them actually go in front of Luton Town, but they did not. They dropped points. Actually, no, that a win would have only gotten them a point back of Luton Town. So they still would have been in the relegation zone, but they they feel too inconsistent. Cardiff just feel too inconsistent to get out of this to me. They have games against West Brom and Norwich, two teams that are not playing for anything, but still Cardiff don't feel like a team that will consistently score goals. Omar Riza did get sacked over the weekend after they lost to Sheffield United. I mean, we kind of saw it coming considering how poorly Cardiff have played, especially lately. It still feels harsh, but with Cardiff heading down to League One, I'm sure they're kind of looking for a manager with more experience that can maybe get them up to the championship and maybe help them stay up in the championship. Plymouth, of course, we talked about how they had the controversial loss to Middlesbrough on Good Friday, and then they go and absolutely own Coventry City, who are on one after the win over West Brom. They have games against Preston and Leeds. So Plymouth very much need a win against Preston on Saturday if they want to have any hope of survival. Their goal differential just though is horrendous. So if they want any survival hopes, they need to have maybe all 6 points this next two games. It feels like the loss to Middlesbrough was huge and could be the moment that relegation kind of sets in for Argyle, which is unfortunate because they have a very good home atmosphere, one of the best in the championship, and always play well there. They showed that today against Coventry. It feels like too little, too late, maybe. But you never know. It's the championship. Leeds might not be playing for anything by that point. They might have secured the title if Burnley somehow slip up. It feels very close to being certain for Plymouth that they're going to get relegated. But they're putting up a fight. They very close to coming away with a point against Middlesbrough. Yeah, let's look at the relegation battle real quick because, like I said, from about 17th down to 24th is a span of 7 points, and from 17th to 22nd is only 4 points. So you've got everyone just scrunched in there tight, and it feels very, very tense because you got a lot of huge matchups like we went over. Plymouth have to play Preston A Plymouth win really makes this very interesting. Yeah, Hull playing Derby County. I would say if somehow Hull lose and Plymouth beat Preston, that could really change the landscape of things. And if Luton somehow also get points against Coventry, then this could be a battle that once again goes down to the final day. This is probably the more intriguing of the races left, considering Leeds and Burnley are tied on points for the title, but Leeds have just such a superior goal difference, and Middlesbrough and Coventry are really fighting it out for the last playoff place. I mean, Bristol City technically are still within reach of both, but I don't know. It feels like if somehow Middlesbrough were to win, Coventry were to lose, and if Bristol City lost to Leeds, then both Coventry and Middlesbrough could somehow overtake Bristol City. Considering Bristol City have Preston North End, though, that might put Bristol City over the top. But we'll have to see. It's the championship, and Preston might be fighting for their life. That concludes our Easter weekend recap of the championship. Who do I think gets out of the relegation scrap? I still think it's going to be Plymouth, Cardiff, and I'm going to say Derby, just because Luton feel like they're in form. They feel like they have what it takes to get out of it with something and barely survive on like the final day when they play West Brom, who has nothing to play for. So if they somehow can get points against Coventry, and if Hull City win, then maybe a point against West Brom seals the deal for the Hatters to stay in the championship, which would be a great escape considering a couple of weeks ago it felt very unlikely that they would escape. But I do think Cardiff and Plymouth are almost certain to be relegated, and it comes down to the final spot. If somehow like Plymouth though do get a win against Preston, they make it very interesting on the final day. Playoff places, I do see Coventry and Middlesbrough it coming down to that final game for the final playoff place. If somehow Middlesbrough don't choke and beat Norwich. And if Coventry lose or, drop any point, then Middlesbrough have a chance to maybe do it with a draw. But if Coventry were to beat Luton Town, though, Middlesbrough have to win and hope that the goal difference is still in their favor, which I don't see Coventry beating Luton Town by 5+ goals. Yeah, because right now the goal difference is in Borough's favor at +10 to +5. It feels like it'll come down to that final day of the season, and it'll be very nerve-wracking for both sets of fans, to be sure. If Millwall's still there again, unless Borough and Coventry both just drop all 6 points somehow, and unless Millwall also wins both their games, that feels very unlikely. Yeah, and that is the recap of the EFL Championship, and that concludes our episode. Thank you so much for tuning in once again. We really appreciate it. Please follow us on all of our social media platforms. We are on Facebook, X, Blue Sky, Instagram, TikTok. We're posting content on the shorts on YouTube and TikTok every single day. Also, we are on Spotify, Amazon, and Apple Podcasts if you just want the audio only experience. And we really appreciate your support and hope to see you for the next episode.